while the eyes of the world are fixed on the brutal trade war fracturing the relationship between North America's closest neighbors, something much quieter and arguably more consequential is unfolding in the shadows. For decades, the bond between the United States and Canada was seen as unbreakable, a partnership defined by the world's longest undefended border. But today, that border is becoming a front line in an economic conflict that is reaching a breaking point. Right now, Canada is locked in a trade war with the U.S. that feels more like a scorched earth campaign than a standard negotiation. We are seeing tariffs climbing as high as 45% on essential goods, and Ottawa has already responded with nearly $30 billion in retaliatory measures targeting American steel, aluminum, and consumer products. It is the most strained point in the modern history of these two nations. But while Washington and Ottawa are trading blows, Beijing is stepping in with a surgical precision that should concern every observer of global geopolitics. While Donald Trump was threatening Canada with these comprehensive tariffs, Canada's foreign minister was returning from Beijing with a development that Washington never anticipated. Chinese officials are calling it a fresh start for bilateral relations. China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, told his counterpart that Beijing is ready to restart dialogue at all levels and rebuild trust. This isn't just casual diplomatic theater or empty pleasantries. This is carefully calibrated language signaling a major strategic realignment happening in real time. Beijing is positioning itself as a potential economic partner and a diplomatic counterweight to Washington precisely when the U.S.-Canada relationship is at its lowest point in generations. The question we have to ask is, while Canada is being squeezed by its oldest ally, what exactly is it surrendering to find relief in the arms of an authoritarian regime? We are seeing the dots connect into a pattern that suggests Canada is drifting away from its traditional orbit. This strategic realignment isn't happening by accident. It is a calculated strategy, driven by extreme economic pressure and enabled by institutional connections that most Canadians don't even know exist. To understand the how, we have to look at the people positioned at the intersection of private capital and public policy. At the center of this web is Mark Carney. Before he was a top advisor to the Prime Minister's inner circle, Carney spent years as the chair of Brookfield Asset Management, one of the world's largest investment firms. During his tenure, Brookfield didn't just have a presence in China, they built a massive, high-stakes exposure totaling over $3 billion in real estate and energy investments. These weren't simple market plays. These investments were linked directly to Chinese state entities and figures connected to Beijing's United Front networks, the very apparatus China uses to exert influence abroad. But it is the smoking gun of the timing that reveals the true nature of these entanglements. When the Chinese market crashed and Brookfield's investments were on the brink of collapse, it wasn't a standard market correction. Instead, the Bank of China stepped in with hundreds of millions of dollars in emergency financing to keep the firm afloat. Let's be clear about the sequence of events. Carney personally traveled to China for meetings with senior Communist Party officials, right as this financial rescue was being negotiated. In fact, just weeks before Brookfield secured a $250 million loan from the Chinese regime, Carney met directly with Xi Jinping himself. These are not routine business transactions. These are deep institutional entanglements involving enormous sums of money and personal relationships at the highest levels of an authoritarian government. These are the exact kind of relationships that do not simply evaporate when a person transitions from corporate leadership to a role where they control national policy. When investigative journalist Sam Cooper brought these facts to the House of Commons Ethics Committee, he laid out a disturbing pattern. He detailed how Carney met repeatedly with United Front leaders in Canadian cities like Markham and Richmond, building the exact vulnerabilities that Beijing exploits. The government's response was a classic study in deflection. Rather than addressing the substance of these multi-billion-dollar ties or the potential for conflict of interest, the Liberal government chose to attack Cooper's sourcing. When uncomfortable facts surface about the financial survival of a firm led by a top government advisor being tied to the Chinese state treasury, the questions about Canadian sovereignty become urgent. This financial architecture provides the foundation for the diplomatic shift we are seeing today, a shift where economic relief from Beijing is prioritized over traditional democratic alliances. While the financial entanglements provide the structural foundation for this realignment, it is the physical violation of Canadian territory that reveals the true, alarming scale of this influence. In 2022, a Spanish civil rights group called Safeguard Defenders uncovered a reality that should have been a national security emergency: secret Chinese police service stations operating openly on Canadian soil. These weren't isolated incidents. We are talking about multiple facilities embedded in the fabric of Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Let that reality settle for a moment. A foreign authoritarian government established its own police operations inside major Canadian cities. Now, the official explanation from Beijing and the one initially echoed in some official circles was that these were merely administrative offices designed to help Chinese nationals with routine paperwork, like renewing driver's licenses. But intelligence reporting tells a much darker story. These stations weren't helping people with their paperwork. They were conducting persuasion to return operations. They were targeting individuals. Beijing wanted back in China, monitoring diaspora communities, and intimidating residents, including Canadian citizens. Safeguard defenders documented at least 80 cases where just one of these networks assisted in capture or coercion operations, and where were they operating? Not in embassies, but out of residential homes, commercial buildings, and even a convenience store in Scarborough. This was the literal extension of China's security apparatus into a democratic country that supposedly maintains sovereignty over its own borders. But perhaps more disturbing than the existence of these stations was the response from the Canadian government. The RCMP launched investigations and eventually claimed the stations were shut down, but the process took over a year. There were no dramatic raids, no public arrests, and no clear accounting of how many stations actually existed or what consequences were faced by those behind them. In fact, some Canadian citizens were reportedly staffing these facilities without understanding their true purpose or while operating under extreme duress. When a foreign government violates your sovereignty that brazenly, and the institutional response is this slow, this opaque, and this ultimately unsatisfying, it sends a dangerous message. It signals that sovereignty is negotiable, that a violation of a nation's core principles might be tolerated if it means maintaining a quiet diplomatic relationship with a powerful authoritarian regime. The pattern of institutional inertia isn't limited to the federal level or major metropolitan hubs like Toronto and Vancouver. It has moved into the quietest corners of the country, revealing a systemic failure to protect Canadian interests. Take, for example, the provincial government of Prince Edward Island. In an extraordinary and rare move, the PEI government formally requested a federal investigation into Chinese interference and money laundering. This wasn't a fringe conspiracy theory or a partisan talking point. This was an official provincial government raising concerns serious enough to warrant a formal inquiry. But look at what happened next. The matter was sent to a committee, discussed in official proceedings, and then in a move that has become a hallmark of this administration, it quietly disappeared from public view. There were no clear findings, no resolution, and ultimately, no accountability. While these investigations were being buried in administrative obscurity, another quiet transformation was taking place on the ground. Chinese companies have continued acquiring Canadian farmland and strategic assets, including properties located near critical infrastructure. This is where the contrast between Ottawa and Washington becomes impossible to ignore. The United States recognized this specific acquisition pattern as a clear national security threat and moved to impose strict restrictions. Canada's response? Instead of action, we saw consultations, reviews, and an endless bureaucratic process that allowed the purchases to continue completely uninterrupted. There is a fundamental difference between careful democratic deliberation and what we are witnessing here, which looks far more like deliberate paralysis, a strategy designed specifically to avoid confronting uncomfortable realities. When provincial governments raise red flags about foreign interference and when intelligence services document sovereignty violations, but the consistent response from the top is delay, deflection, and bureaucratic burial, you have to ask a very difficult question. Who actually benefits from keeping these investigations quiet? The answer is becoming increasingly clear, and it isn't the Canadian public. This silence in politics is rarely accidental. When legitimate questions make powerful people this uncomfortable, it usually means those questions are touching something real, something those in power would prefer to keep hidden. By the time the public conversation catches up to the reality of these strategic acquisitions, the infrastructure of influence is already in place, making it nearly impossible to dislodge. We are seeing a gradual shifting of alignment occurring incrementally, piece by piece, without a single dramatic moment to force a public reckoning. To truly understand how Canada reached this dangerous inflection point, we have to look past the current headlines and examine the philosophical roots of its leadership. We have to go back to a moment years before the current trade war or the discovery of secret police stations that revealed exactly how certain Canadian leaders view the fundamental trade-offs between democratic governance and authoritarian efficiency. At a Toronto fundraiser in 2013, a young Liberal Party leader named Justin Trudeau was asked which nation's administration he admired most. His answer was remarkable for its candor. He stated that there was a level of admiration he had for China because their basic dictatorship allowed them to turn their economy around on a dime. He spoke specifically about the flexibility of a system where you can do whatever you want, calling the concept quite interesting. At the time, critics largely dismissed the comment as a gaffe, a lapse in judgment from a politician known for speaking without thinking through the implications. But as the pattern of the last decade shows, when powerful people tell you what they admire, you should listen. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was a window into a fundamental worldview. It revealed how a future prime minister weighed the rapid implementation of a totalitarian regime against the messy reality of free societies. For years after that comment, relations between Ottawa and Beijing appeared to be in a deep freeze. Following the arrest of a Huawei executive at America's request, Beijing retaliated by detaining two Canadian citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. It was a period of open hostility, but recently, that confrontation has shifted into what analysts describe as a charm offensive. As the pressure from Washington intensifies through tariffs and trade disputes, Beijing is once again offering the flexibility and efficiency that Trudeau once praised. They are offering market access and investment capital as a form of relief from American hostility. The concern is that the admiration for authoritarian efficiency didn't disappear during the deep freeze. It was simply waiting for the right economic conditions to resurface. When you are being squeezed by your closest ally, the temptation to seek help from a power that can turn on a dime becomes overwhelming. But help from Beijing always comes with strings attached, strings that aren't visible until it's too late to cut them loose. We are seeing a leader's long-held fascination with authoritarian control manifest as a strategic realignment that sacrifices long-term democratic security for short-term economic flexibility. What we are witnessing is not just a localized trade dispute, it is a masterclass in sophisticated economic statecraft. China has spent years pursuing a deliberate strategy of dividing Western allies, using economic leverage and diplomatic pressure to create wedges between countries that would otherwise present a unified opposition to Beijing's regional ambitions. Canada represents an extraordinarily valuable target in this game of global chess. It is a G7 nation with vast natural resources, advanced technology sectors, and a strategic geographic position sandwiched directly between the United States and the Arctic. If Beijing can pull a country like Canada, one of America's closest allies and its security guarantor, even partially into its orbit, it represents a massive strategic victory that would have seemed impossible a decade ago. The contrast in the language being used right now is jarring. While trade talks between Canada and the United States have completely collapsed and tariffs have climbed to levels not seen in generations, Beijing is using the language of reconciliation. China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, is explicitly stating that Beijing wants to restart exchanges at all levels and rebuild trust. They are positioning themselves as the reasonable partner willing to engage constructively, precisely when Washington is treating Ottawa like an adversary over trade disputes. This is the trap. Beijing creates pain through one channel and offers relief through another. They are offering exactly what Ottawa needs: market access and investment capital positioned as a sanctuary from Washington's hostility. But as we've seen with the financial entanglements of the past, help from Beijing always comes with strings attached. Those strings aren't always visible until it is far too late to cut them loose. The country that stands to benefit most from this fracturing of the North American relationship isn't in North America at all. It's on the other side of the Pacific, watching as one of America's oldest allies drifts steadily into its sphere of influence. The question is whether Canada recognizes that by accepting this short-term economic relief, it is creating long-term strategic vulnerabilities that threaten the entire Western alliance. The evidence we've analyzed, from multi-billion-dollar real estate rescues to secret police stations and a decade-long admiration for authoritarian efficiency, reveals a pattern that is no longer possible to ignore. This is not a series of unrelated diplomatic hiccups. It is a gradual shifting of alignment occurring incrementally, designed to avoid a single dramatic moment that would force a public reckoning. The infrastructure for this realignment is already built, and once these financial and institutional entanglements are finalized, reversing them will be extraordinarily difficult. These implications extend far beyond Ottawa, threatening the integrity of the entire Western alliance structure. The ultimate question is whether Canada recognizes exactly what it is trading away for short-term relief before the transformation becomes irreversible. The dots are there, and the pattern is visible, but only for those willing to see it.